Yes, welcome to the Bridge Podcast. I am Sammy Peters, and today I am sat with Professor Michael Gervers, who I've had the pleasure of being in a history course for a whole semester. And you were probably one of the first people I thought of when I came up with this podcast that I thought, yeah, I really want to have a proper sit-down conversation with this man because I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but on my way to one of your classes, you were also on the TTC, and I spoke to you a little bit for like half an hour, and I remember going to that class afterwards, and I was like, there are so many stories here. So I'm really happy to be doing this. If you want to introduce yourself.
Fantastic, Sammy. Absolutely. Well, I've been teaching probably longer than anybody else at UTSC.
Right.
And so I've had a wide diversity of students. They are my greatest pleasure. My students are my greatest pleasure.
Really?
They bring innovation to my life, and it's amazing. I had I had an email last year from somebody who said, Professor Gervers, I took your course umpteen years ago. I never we submitted papers. And I never had so much red ink on my paper in my entire life, and so many corrections. And he said, I decided I was going to tackle them. Most students don't, right? They kind of either throw the paper away, they don't look at it. But this guy, I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. Anyway, he wrote, he said he'd really studied all of the corrections so he could improve his writing.
Sure.
And then he got really into it, and he went on after graduation. He went on to do an MA, and then he went on to do a PhD, and then he spent his life in teaching. I had not heard from him for about 40 years.
Oh, that
and
long?
He writes me this message and says, Thank you, Professor Gervers. If it hadn't been for you marking up my paper like that, I would not have had a career in education. So that was, often we don't hear from our students. Right?
Yeah.
Most of the students, you never hear from them again, except like this one, 40 years later.
40 years later.
Or maybe
unexpected.
it was 30. I can't remember, but it was but one of the earliest ones.
Yeah, no, I remember submitting an essay as well, and a lot of red ink.
Oh, okay.
And it was like one of the first classes where I started it, and there were a lot of readings, and I was like, this is so much. And then as the class progressed, I just slowly started getting into it a bit more, just because I don't know. It was like one of the rare classes where I just really got into the readings. So.
Yeah, good. Well, I insist on the readings because there are a lot of people who know things better than I do, and through reading you can reach the very top, but you need to have a sense of that you really do want to learn.
Yeah.
It's for me. Going to the university just for the sake of going to the university is kind of meaningless. But if you go because, first of all, you're privileged to go to the university because so many people don't have that opportunity. But if you because education is an investment in yourself, right? You can read and it all becomes part of you. You can write and it can become part of somebody else what you write. So and nobody can take it away.
Pick it up.
Nobody can take what you've studied. They can't take it away from you unless they brainwash you.
You're true. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but how come you got into teaching? Because obviously you've been in academia for a very long time, and you've gone from a master's to
it goes
a PhD.
way back. Way back. I was always interested in the Middle Ages, for example.
Yeah.
Since I was maybe 8 years old.
Okay.
I had a great uncle in England. I was born in the UK. Had a great uncle.
Yes.
Who was an antiquarian and collected arms and armor. And I remember when I was an 8-year-old, I remember visiting his house, this medieval house in Kent in the UK.
Okay, yeah.
And it was dark, but there's these suits of armor were here and there. And I guess that got me started. So for many years, I was deeply interested in that aspect of material culture, and I've always been interested in material culture since. Right. Not just the books, but should we say human productivity?
Yeah,
that goes hand in hand with what you read about. So, when I went to university, By the time I was in my second year, I had decided I was going to do a PhD.
Okay.
Right? So one of the things that I noticed that often students say they're going to graduate and they don't want to continue because they don't quite know what they want to study. They don't know what they want to do. A lot of students don't know what they want to do, right, after they get their degree. I've always known what I wanted to do. There's never been a question for me, right?
That's
I didn't have to waste my time worrying about
sitting and asking that question.
That question, or going out and trying to figure out, should I do this or that? It was kind of, once you decide you want to do a PhD, the road is pretty straight.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you can do it quickly. It took me 7 years when I came to Toronto to do the PhD. It took me 7 years to finish, but that's because I chose a larger topic than I had anticipated.
Fair. Okay. So let's rewind a little bit. So you were born in the UK.
Right.
Whereabouts?
I was born in Hertfordshire. It's about 20, I'm thinking in those days we spoke in miles, and so I remember it in miles, about 20 miles north of London.
Okay.
During the war, my mother told me that she could see the fires of London burning during the bombing of Britain. I have a few images. There was an anti-aircraft gun across the street. There's a lane, a country lane, but there was an anti-aircraft gun there with the soldiers around, just literally in front of the house.
Wow.
I was too young to remember, but my mother said that she was talking to the milkman one day with me in her arm, and suddenly a German buzz bomb it was a V1. The V1s were fueled. They would go put, 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 put. And when the fuel ran out, they fell. And so while she was talking to the milkman, put, put, put.
One just fell.
And it fell. So as she said, the windows went in and out, but nobody was hurt. But it's war was around.
Yeah, and that's I think I grew up in Belgium, so there's obviously a lot of when you do your education there, like middle school and elementary, you still are very exposed to the history of the war, both of them, and I guess you don't really I, in any case, didn't realize how rich Northwestern Europe is in history up until I moved here. And especially the UK and in Belgium, obviously, where the Second World War was, a lot happened there. And I think moving here, I gained a much deeper appreciation for it, which is also then why I ended up doing a history minor.
That actually is a distinction between people growing up in Europe and people growing up in North America. In Europe, it's part of your society. You walk past medieval buildings every day on the way to school.
Yeah.
In North America, you have to study it at the same time. And if you don't, you probably won't know about it.
No. Yeah.
On the other hand, if you do study it, then
travel.
Travel is really important.
Travel. Yeah.
I recommend travel to everybody.
Well, you've done a lot of it. You have done a lot of it. So, and then at 6 years old, if I'm correct, you moved to.
We left UK when I was 5.
When you were 5.
Right.
To Connecticut.
So you want a little bit more? I mean, a 30-second history of my life?
There's an hour-long history of your life.
Okay. So here we go. So we left the UK after the war. My father's company sent him to New York.
Okay.
So my first view of the New World was from rural New York State. We lived there for about 6 months. Then we moved to Connecticut.
Right.
And I spent the next 10 years. I would say, that's a fundamental part of your life between the ages of 6 and 16.
Absolutely.
And I sort of grew up in Connecticut. In between, I spent a year in Pennsylvania.
Okay. Just right next to it, right?
It's a little far away. To go from Connecticut to Pennsylvania, you have to go through New Jersey.
Okay.
I can't remember how we did it. But
my American geography is not great. So
catch up on that. They're talking about the 51st state, right? Okay, so.
So what was that transition like? If you were at 6 years old, I don't really know if you know what's going on, if you know what's happening.
Okay.
Do you?
I don't think I knew what was going on.
Yeah.
But it was affecting me because I was even before I left the UK. My mom said that she had spoken to the sort of nursery school teacher when I was 5 about going to North America. And apparently the nursery school teacher says, I don't know if he can handle it.
Oh.
I don't know what that was all about, but I was a very anxious child. Very anxious until I turned 13. And then I never looked back. I somehow, I talking to the right people, I got out of this
bubble.
Well, it was a kind of a fear.
Right.
I mean, I was afraid of almost everything, right? If I read something one way, I had to read it backwards to make sure I didn't transgress anything by having read it. So it's a known phenomenon. Anyway, I got over that.
So what do you think happened? Like, what would you think caused that?
Anxiety.
Yeah. But then at 13, you said you got out of it. Like, was that just you going into a different stage of school where you talk to different people and you're more exposed
it was like that. Yeah. I think so. Okay. Because there was a time when I was so anxious I couldn't even go to school.
Really?
Right? I couldn't get out of the car. My mom would drive me to school. Couldn't get out of the car. So, anxiety is something which one needs to confront and deal with, because otherwise it'll control you for the rest of your life. Anyway, so from the age of 13, I never looked back.
Okay.
And over time, I also overcame fear. I'm sort of fearless. I was hijacked in an airplane once in India, and it's no good being afraid, right? You have to deal with the situation, and fear usually prevents you from acting. Although the hijackers had guns, so we weren't going to act noticeably.
Sure. So
that's another story. That takes a
well,
little longer.
we're gonna get into that because I do really want to hear about that. But
okay,
but that's a good preview then.
Anyway, so I'll just quickly continue with my. By this time I'm 13, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when I was 15, I spent a year at school in Switzerland.
Yes.
My mother's brother, my uncle, had health problems, and he went to Switzerland.
Your uncle?
My uncle had health problems with his lungs.
Right.
He went to Switzerland, where the air was cleaner, and in order to support himself, he founded a school. And that you can look it up on the internet. It's called Aiglon, Aiglon College.
I did look it up, and because I hadn't heard of it before.
Right.
And do you know where one of my older brothers went in the late 90s, 2000s? Beausoleil.
Okay, Beausoleil was across the street.
Which is a 5-minute walk from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But Aiglon, Beausoleil was more, I would say it was more French. Aiglon was definitely English, although we had to speak French at meals. If we wanted to have a hot chocolate, we had to speak French. So by the time I was 16, I could speak French. And in the interim, my dad's job sent him out to San Francisco. So I remember being enrolled in the French class, and the teacher only spoke French. She was really good. It was one of my best memories in high school was this teacher. And so after the class, the students all came to me and said, "What did she say? What did she say?" I did understand more or less what she'd said. Anyway, so that was in Palo Alto. So I graduated from Pali High, one of the best high schools in North America.
Okay.
Really good school. That was long before Silicon Valley, but it was a good experience. And as a consequence, I got, I don't know if it was a consequence, I worked really hard. The principal actually called me into his office and said, "We want you to run for legislative council president." I'd only been there for a year, right? So they must have seen something, right?
Yeah.
Because there's one thing which I learned at Aiglon was responsibility. If you want to be a success in life, you have to be responsible. You have to take responsibility. Yeah. And if it doesn't come your way, should we say naturally, you can do it yourself. I think you shouldn't wait for things to happen to you. You should make them happen, right? I mean, you've undertaken to do this interviewing, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's a plus. You've made this a responsibility for yourself, and I think any young person will profit from having taken responsibility, because that is a reflection of self-confidence. The way to get through this thing we call life is self-confidence. If you have self-confidence, you can make your way so much better than if you're somehow reluctant to take that step forward because you're afraid of the consequences.
Right.
You should never fear consequences. You should be smart enough to figure out, if you do this, that's going to happen, and you don't want that to happen. So maybe you get to your destination around the back way.
Well, I think for a lot of people nowadays, like trying to take action, trying to take a step forward and gain responsibility, I think with social media and everything, it's all very public. So it's all like anyone can see it. So if it fails or if it doesn't do well, that's also public. And I think a lot of people sort of get intimidated by that. But yeah.
I can imagine. Now, I'll tell you,
Yeah.
I know nothing about social media. I don't touch it. For me, it's the plague.
That's fair enough.
I see my students. I get on the bus. Everybody's got their cell phone in their hand, and God knows what they're doing with it. I'm old-fashioned. I think I have the right to be old-fashioned, but I get the Guardian newspaper sent to me, the weekly edition, and I carry it wherever I go. So I read something that is not tiny in my hand.
Yeah.
But that's not specifically social media. But I think that people open themselves up to traumatic experiences using social media. I don't think anybody needs it. If you grow up with it, then it's normal for you. Right?
I think, no, I don't think it's a necessity, but I do think today you do need it. Like if you've grown up with it, I think a lot of, opportunities in the future or just a lot of socializing happens through social media. So it has sort of become a necessity. I think if all of a sudden everyone is stripped away from it, then that's great. But
okay.
Like for me, if I were to now delete all social media, which I wish I could, I would just be completely out of the loop of everything.
Yeah, I see. You got to keep up with the rest of them. As long as it's okay. As long as you don't spend all your time doing it.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it is very time consuming. I find when I'm sort of doing anything with my laptop, time goes very quickly, more quickly than I can really imagine beforehand. But it's difficult for you to imagine a world without social media and being able to connect. What did we have? We had the telephone, and we had the post office. No, most people today cannot find the post office, right? And I'm not surprised. A stamp costs you $2.50 or something ridiculous. If you want to send a letter to Europe, you got to pay through the nose for it.
Yeah.
Well, when I first came to Toronto, you could send a letter within the city of Toronto for 3 cents.
Okay.
3 cents. Maybe the bus ride was 20 cents, right?
Yeah.
But all the same. So the means of communication have changed incredibly and increasingly so. I can remember around after we came to North America that we wanted to phone my grandmother at Christmas time. So here we were, Mom and Dad, my brother and I, huddled around the phone for 3 minutes to be able to talk to Granny. And we were, hello, Granny, are you there? Merry Christmas. And we're kind of over. But that was a once-a-year event. And long-distance calls were expensive.
Yeah.
So, I mean, now you can call anywhere in the world. You can use an app and it doesn't cost you anything. Yeah. So it's amazing.
Yeah. So, to go back again to Aiglon College, I think going from North America to school in Switzerland has to be like a huge culture shock. No? And like I think
Yeah. Yes and no.
I think moving at that age, it really teaches you a lot. And it gives you certain independence that you wouldn't have if you had stayed. So yeah.
Right. Okay. So questions of security were not as great then as now. We didn't lock our houses, right? I was 6 years old, and I would walk a mile to school and back by myself in the dark. Right. People didn't worry about being kidnapped. Somehow, we've become very fearful. We're living, well, until a few months ago, in probably the most secure place in the world. But everybody's afraid. Everybody's afraid of something happening to them. And I don't know, have we spawned a whole gambit of weirdos who are out there to do damage? They're out there, and they do damage.
Yeah.
So I can't say that I know what the reason.
But do you think there's more damage being done by people than there was at the time?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's reason for it,
absolutely.
Right?
No. Well, this is the 1950s by this time. And in the 1950s, after the war, people were, I don't know, they'd gone through a really bad time. The war was one thing. The 1930s, everybody was, either on a breadline or somehow suffered the difficulties of living through the recession in the 1930s. But in 1950s, everybody was really positive. Rock and roll was, I can remember, John Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock. I can remember that. And so on. And that kept building into the 60s. But then, I don't know, maybe the 1980s things began to decline. I mean, I think governments like to make us fearful. So, we were afraid of communism. We were afraid of a Russian attack.
Red Scare.
We had plane watchers on 24 hours a day in the 1950s on top of the school looking for Russian planes.
Really?
They never came, of course. And we were drilled to, in case of the siren alarm went off, to get under our desks, this kind of thing. Well, North America hadn't. This is North America. This is not Europe. I don't think the Europeans were doing this, but the North Americans were doing it. So but at the same time, I never felt in danger. In as I mentioned, Connecticut, we were. It wasn't quite a commuter town, but it was
close,
suburban.
Yeah.
It was suburban to New York City.
Sure. And so, do you think that sense of community that you sort of had, I think, was a lot easier to get a few decades ago? How do you think that has left or eroded now?
Living in a big city is so different from living outside the city.
Yeah, but would it not be divided between neighborhoods still?
Absolutely. But here I live in the annex. I know my immediate neighbors, but I don't know. I hardly know the people 3 doors away.
Right.
And there's not much effort to get to know, because I think a lot of people are anxious about their neighbors. They don't want to get to know them very much.
Yeah.
So, but the sense of community, there you find your community elsewhere, right? I find my community amongst my colleagues. I think people who go to church or the synagogue or the temple, the mosque, they find a community there as well, sure. Which is more because people like to be together with people who think the same way as they do.
Like-minded,
absolutely.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean you have to stay there. I think
no, like-minded but not close-minded.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
you said it very well.
Yeah. So you've done that year at Aiglon, and then it was just a year, right?
1 year, yeah.
What did you take from that afterwards when you went back to America?
I told you the sense of responsibility was really important. I learned French. which I recommend for every Canadian.
Vous parlez encore français?
Oui,
Okay.
oui, j'arrive.
Okay.
Dans le temps, c'était beaucoup mieux que maintenant.
Mais... Ouais, je peux imaginer.
Okay, sure. So
because my brother, when he went to Beausoleil, he
was speaking French already, right?
Well, it was English speaking when he went, because he doesn't. He doesn't speak much French, or a little bit, but he most of the time there he spoke English. Okay. And he still now has friends from his time there that he's extremely close with, and great connections to have as you go into the adult life. Sure. And so are there still people from Aiglon that you're still in touch with that have influenced you?
There are a few, and I have a few Swiss friends who I've probably known longer than anybody ever.
Okay.
I'm thinking of one family in particular. They're over 90 now.
Okay.
So it's been a long time. And Switzerland has all kinds of things. They've got good museums. In fact, I was trying to find a catalog of a sale that took place in Paris in 1953. And I asked the librarian, how can I get this catalog? She said, well, check World Cat, which we did. And it found that there were 2 examples of this catalog known.
Okay.
Right? And one of them was in a museum in Zurich. So I wrote to the museum and said, any chance you could get me a digital copy of this? And they wrote back and said, yeah, we'll have it to you by next week. It was amazing, absolutely amazing, and and this actually leads back to Ethiopia. Just I'll give you a footnote there,
please.
That there's a very old church in Ethiopia, which had a collection of Islamic textiles dating from the 9th and 10th century, very, very rare. And during the Italian occupation, 1936 to 1941, somebody managed to apparently take them out, and they ended up for sale in 1953 in Paris.
Okay.
And now, because I was trying to track them down, and now it turns out some of them are in the Islamic Museum in Doha.
Oh wow.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so I knew, first of all, that they were in Doha. And I wrote to the curator and I said, could you please tell me, give me some more information about these textiles, which come from, it's called the monastery of Debre Damo in Ethiopia. And she said, we don't have anything like that in our records at all. We don't they come from Debre Damo. So they apparently had bought them in the late 1990s. Had no clue as to where they came from.
Not from Paris.
No, the museum had no idea where they came from.
A gap in between.
So I've been informing them.
Okay. And so you go back to America, and then you do
California.
You go to California.
While I was away in Switzerland, my dad was sent out to San Francisco.
Yeah. You go to school in Palo Alto?
Yeah, I graduated from Palo Alto High School.
And then Princeton.
And then I went to, from there I went to Princeton.
Okay.
I applied to Stanford, but I didn't get in. Too close.
Well, I don't think Princeton's too bad of a second option.
No, I was happier, actually. But almost everybody in the school was applying to Stanford, right? Because literally it's across the street. It has a very good reputation. But I was happy to go to Princeton.
Okay. And then you do your master's in Poitiers.
I did my master's in Poitiers in France,
yeah,
sort of west central France. And that's what brought me to Toronto. Because while I was in Poitiers, I met a professor. His name was Dembowski. He was in the French department. Wonderful man. He was on sabbatical in Poitiers. And I was looking for somewhere to go for the PhD.
Yeah.
And mostly I was looking in the USA. And he said, well, why don't you consider Toronto? Because they've just started this medieval studies program. And I applied and was accepted. Right. And then I said to Dembowski, I said, thank you so much. They've accepted me, but I don't have any money. He said, oh, that's not a problem. I'll write to the French department. We'll get you a job.
Oh, wow.
And another 10 days went by. letter came back from the French department at University College.
Okay.
And
right down
and I had a job.
Right down the street.
So I had no financial problems coming to
Wow.
to Toronto and working on the PhD.
And why Poitiers to start with? Can I
Why
ask?
Poitiers? Because they have a Centre d'études médiévales.
Okay.
Right, it's very well known,
Okay.
and it's a going concern.
Yeah.
And you know, I told you I had already decided I wanted to do the PhD when
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
in the
yeah,
second
yeah.
year. And I might add as a footnote that we had a program at the university which was called Work Study Abroad. It was mostly work rather than study.
Okay.
So I got at the end of my first year, I got a job working for a big bank in Paris.
Okay.
Where my responsibility was to really interact with English-speaking people who needed to change their money.
Yeah.
But that was a great experience. Here I was, working, and I must have been about 20 years old at the time.
Okay.
And from that time on, every summer I went back to France, and either worked or studied.
Visits. Okay. And there's a chance I might have made this up in my head from a previous conversation we've had, but did you not at one point spend time in a monastery in France?
Yeah, I did, absolutely.
Okay, I didn't make that up.
No.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, no. I'm glad I did that. In fact, I don't.
What led to that decision?
What led to my going to the monastery?
Yeah.
A girlfriend. She.
You wanted to
my
escape her?
first love, and she decided that she preferred somebody else. So I was feeling very distraught. I remember I think it was in February, and it was raining, it was freezing. I had one of these motorized bicycles called a Solex, and I went off in I guess the late because it gets dark early in the wintertime. So I arrived at the monastery. I remember in the dark, it was raining, cold, and the next day I think I let them know I was coming, right? But the next day, they have what's called the Père Hôtelier. The Père Hôtelier, he's the one who looks after guests.
Yep.
And very nice monk. He said, so why did you come? And I said, well, because I'm studying the Middle Ages. And then he said, and what else? I said, well, there's a girl. Why didn't you say so sooner? So that started it off, and it was a very good experience. Did I tell you this? They tried to chase the devil out of me.
No,
They took me into the
I
field.
briefly remember this, yeah.
They took me into the field. The monk said, it's a spring, the grass is green, why don't you take off your shoes and feel the grass under your feet? So no problem, I took off my shoes. And then we came to a cow paddy, and he said, why don't you walk through it? And he did, he sort of walked through this warm cow paddy. And I said to I think I'll wait on that one.
Yeah, fair enough.
But then he took me out to out of the field onto this stony road, and I heard him whisper under his breath, "Nous allons chasser le diable de ce jeune homme." We're going to chase the devil out of this guy. So anyway, it was a good experience, and after that, I went to another monastery, not very far away from Poitiers.
Okay.
And it was. It was important. I took advantage of the opportunity to study Latin.
Okay.
And we worked it out such that every day after lunch, a monk would come to my room and we'd do Latin together for an hour.
Wow.
It worked out very well because I knew that because by that time I had already been accepted to the Center for Medieval Studies in Toronto, and I knew that Latin was a requirement. So I was digging in my heels to learn Latin.
Yes, that was a perfect opportunity.
Right. But all kinds of weird things happen even in monasteries. So.
How so?
Well, one day I found a mole in my bed, and there was a monastery is a place where sometimes parents send their unruly children.
Okay, it's kind of like boarding school.
Well, like reform school, I would say. Anyway, this guy was pretty uncontrollable. I guess he was a teenager, and so I found this mouse in my bed, and I just threw it out the window. And then he said, didn't you see something strange in your bed? So I knew immediately that it was him, right?
Yeah.
I said, no, didn't see it. So just one aside.
Okay, and then, so now I would like to get into your field work, because, well, there's a big gap in between, I think, because from Poitiers you go to Toronto.
To Toronto, right?
And then you do your PhDs, which was a 7-year process?
Yeah, I think I should interject that while I was in Poitiers, in the summer session, they had students from all over. They were very supportive of young people from behind the so-called Iron Curtain. The only reason they called it the Iron Curtain really was that the people on the other side, the east side, didn't have any money, so they couldn't travel. So the French government was making it possible for some of these students to travel.
Okay.
And during the course of the spring and winter and spring, I had become introduced to the phenomenon of rock-hewn churches which are carved out of the cliff. Look it up. The internet's filled with them once you know about them.
Yeah.
But in those days, hardly anybody knew about them. Anyway, I went to one of these sites, a village south of Angoulême called Gurat, G-U-R-A-T, and here was this church underneath the village, right? I mean, there was a falaise, a cliff, and so you could see it from the outside, but you had to sort of go down a passageway in order to get inside.
Okay.
And I had a peek at it, and I came up and I met this elderly gentleman who said, and I asked him, what's the history of this church? And he said, well, when the waters of the great flood receded, lo and behold, here was this church. Well, this is 2000 BC or something like that, long before Christianity. But anyway, it turned out he was the local landowner. He was the local nobleman of the region. And when he learned that I was working in Poitiers or studying in Poitiers, he said, well, why don't you come down with a team and excavate the church?
Wow.
Oh, I thought that was great. So I went back to Poitiers and I started asking these students whether they would like to participate in the excavation of a rock-hewn church. And
it's a big responsibility.
Sorry?
That's a big responsibility.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
Right, but it was more a question of time. They had come, they had their visas, and so they wanted to go and spend that extra week or 2 weeks at the end of the session traveling in France. So, in desperation, one day at lunch, there was this Hungarian girl who hardly had spoken a word during the whole of the session because her French wasn't that good, and so I said to her, would you be interested in joining an archaeological expedition? She eyes lit up like this, big smile. Turned out she was a professional archaeologist. So we went off together with a third person, Michel Schlumberger, a very well-known French family. She turned out to ended up teaching at a university in France. Anyway, so the Hungarian with the big eyes, 2 years later I married her and brought her to Toronto. This is Veronica. And Veronica very quickly, she arrived in December. By July, she had a job as a curator in the Royal Ontario Museum.
Just like that.
And so that's one of the reasons we stayed in Toronto.
How did you convince her to move to Toronto?
How did I convince her? I don't know. Maybe she loved me.
Hopefully.
In those days, getting out from behind the Iron Curtain was a big thing. But I don't think that was the reason. I think that, we really loved each other.
Okay.
So it was no question. In fact, I said, would you leave Hungary for me? And she said immediately, without blinking an eye, she said, yes. And so I thought she'd misunderstood. I asked her again. She said, yes, okay.
Double check.
We're going to work on this. So what I wanted to say was, in the year after we had met, my brother had inherited a 1935 Austin from my great aunt. It was a huge, beautiful car with headlights, huge bulbous headlights and a running board and leather upholstery. The only trouble was it was a 1935 model, and it kept breaking down. But I said I would join. He wanted to drive to Jerusalem, right from the UK, where it was. So I said, I would love to do that with you as long as we followed the route of the First Crusade, which went through Budapest, which is where I wanted to meet Veronica. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So anyway, am I off question?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
Anyway, we went on this. We drove and we got to Budapest with a few problems. After that, I met Veronica. That's when I asked her to marry me, and then I continued on, and eventually we had to abandon the car in Istanbul because it apparently wasn't insured on the other side of the Bosphorus. So
once you got into Asia,
So then I took advantage of that opportunity to look at the rock-hewn churches in Cappadocia, which are really something. You look that up on the internet. Goreme, Göreme, amazing place. In the 7th or 8th, 9th century, there was something called the iconoclastic controversy, in which the emperors were iconoclasts. They were against the representation of holy figures because they felt people were taking those figures and turning them and worshiping them as an icon, for example. Yeah. So they said no more of this.
I remember learning about it.
Right. So the monks all fled out to Cappadocia. Some of them went out to Cappadocia. At that time, Sicily was still a Byzantine territory, so some of them went to southern Italy and Sicily, and where they dug themselves in by carving a space for themselves out of the rock, both in what is now Turkey, right? Yeah. South central Turkey and southern Italy. So that added to this interest in rock-hewn architecture, where I spent a lot of my time over the years.
And is that then, so you're in Istanbul, and then you have to ditch the car?
I took a bus.
And did that,
I took a bus out to Göreme.
Okay, and did that, everything that you saw in Cappadocia, is that what then led you to go deeper into Ethiopia, into the Anglican churches there?
Unfortunately, Veronica died when she was really quite young. We knew about Ethiopia being an important site for rock-hewn churches. But I didn't get there until, I guess, 3 years after she died, which was in the early 80s. And, but even when Ethiopia is always at war. It's amazing. When I went there in the early 80s, they had just done in Haile Selassie, I guess 8 years before. And the country had taken on a kind of communist government for the sake of satisfying the Russians because the Americans had backed out. So it wasn't until the early 90s that I actually got to see the rock churches in the country. But I've been going back ever since.
Yeah, almost every year, no? Until 2020.
Between 2000 and 2020, I went at least once a year. Right. But since 2020, the conditions have been deplorable. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. And so I'm advised not to go, especially by my son, who said, "Dad, you got to keep out of trouble."
It's probably a smarter choice. Is that bothering you? Would you still like to go?
Of course.
Do you miss it?
Well, I do. Yeah. I mean, I've got a big investment. I've just sent a book to the publisher about Ethiopia. I'm working on another one that I've been working on for 15 years, 20 maybe, almost 20 years. No, 15. And I teach it, and you may know that I introduced the teaching of Old Ethiopic to the UT.
Yeah.
We, with the help of the university and the Ethiopian community, we raised. By the way, the familiar name to our listeners will be the Weekend. we can put up $60,000
Really?
towards this. Absolutely. So
I didn't
that
know.
made the headlines. When I gave them a lot of money, it didn't make a lot of headlines. But when the weekend gave the money, it made the headlines. And we eventually raised 500,000, and that now supports.
Because he's from Ethiopia as well, right?
Oh
He's
yeah,
from
yeah. But he was born. He was born here. He's born in Scarborough.
Yeah.
He was born in Scarborough. Yeah. But his parents were born in Ethiopia.
Yeah. So what's a day when you were there? What's a day in the life like
in Ethiopia?
Yeah.
Oh, you get up really early in the morning.
Okay.
Because if you want to visit churches, they have a service, so around 6 o'clock, and if you get there before the service ends, then you have the opportunity of hopefully visiting a church. Because once the service is over, the door is locked until the next day, right? So you got to, we were often up at 5 o'clock, and as the sun began to rise, it was cold. It's very cold in Ethiopia in the morning. It gets hot during the day, but early morning is cold. And so, we would then spend our day documenting either the physical building of the church. Right. There'd be mural paintings. We would make measurements, and then we would ask to see their so-called paraphernalia, their crosses, their manuscripts, anything of interest from the past.
Okay.
And with that, my colleague Eva Bolitska-Witakovska and I started this website called Mazgaba Selat. You can get there. I'll just mention it. There are 70,000 photographs, mostly mine, on this website.
Okay. Made
since 1982. So you do, what is it? ethiopia.utsc.utoronto.ca. Okay. And then you need a password and a username and a password, which is student. Just put in student.
Okay.
And you're into 70,000.
Okay. I'll put those instructions in the video box in the description.
Okay.
Okay.
So anyway, you asked me about a typical day. You have to negotiate. Sometimes you go out to a church and they won't let you in.
Okay.
So you go away disappointed. Next day you go to another church and they're delighted to see you. They show you everything.
Did you find it hard to sort of integrate there and meet people that would help you, or was it very warm and hospitable?
Well, generally, I'd say that the northern Ethiopians, historically, ancient Ethiopia is what is today Eritrea and Tigray.
Okay.
Right, where all this war has been taking place.
Okay.
So those, when I say highland, we're talking about between 2,000 and 4,000 meters. So a long way up, right? So I would say if you live in the mountains, you have a mentality, right? It's like the Swiss. You need to know what you're doing. Your life depends on it. Yeah. But you're also cautious about outsiders.
Sure.
So, but generally speaking, we were well received. Sometimes, we unexpectedly something would happen, negative. But for the most part, it worked out quite well.
Okay.
And I should also add that, they may fight with each other, but they leave the foreigners alone.
Really?
Yeah. No. So foreigners, even during this 2-year terrible massacre warfare that was going on between 2020 and 2022, I can think of one case in which I think she was a Portuguese aid worker who was attacked in her car and left dead on the road. But that was very rare that a European should have been attacked.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody found out who did it.
And then you've also done fieldwork in Mongolia.
I've done fieldwork in Mongolia. It's my other favorite
Your
place.
other venture.
Right. Mongolia.
I just find it very impressive, just all these different places.
Why was I? The next question is, why was I interested in Mongolia? It's not because I'm looking for the most faraway places in the world, but that actually links up with Veronica, with my late wife. she got a job at the ROM in the textile department.
Okay.
And because of her Hungarian background, she was interested in looking at clothing traditions sort of from the East, because the Hungarians came from the East in the 9th century. They were the last settlers in Europe, as it were, as a unit.
Yeah.
And so she was studying costume. And so
The Huns?
Sorry?
The Huns? In the 9th
Well,
century?
the Huns, let's see, who are considered to be the Huns? No, the Huns are earlier than the Hungarians.
Okay.
There's probably a relationship, but we don't know what language the Huns spoke, for example.
Okay.
Right? There's another group. There were the Huns, and then there were the Avars, who occupied the Carpathian Basin until King Charlemagne came along and killed them all off.
Okay.
And then the next wave were the Hungarians.
Okay.
And they pestered the Germans and the Italians for 100 years,
Sure.
Or 150 years before they finally became Roman Catholics,
Okay.
as it were, Catholics, and then things began to settle down.
Okay. So that was a bit off track.
Okay.
I want to see if I was right.
Right.
But yeah.
So, we decided we were going to go to Istanbul, which was one of my favorite cities. Fascinating place, at least it was. It's perhaps somewhat less so now, but in those days, there was a real bazaar, right? Now you would go to the bazaar in Istanbul, it's filled with Chinese cheap stuff. But anyway, so the curator of the textile department at the time, Harold Burnham, produced this photograph of a shepherd from the National Geographic, and he was wearing what's known as a kepenek, which is a wool garment.
Okay.
But we didn't know much about it. But we got to Istanbul because Burnham said, if you can find one of these, bring it back for the museum.
Sure.
And this started an important adventure. In life, you just don't know where it's going to come from, where the influences that are going to take you further are going to come from.
Yeah.
So.
From what I've learned, it's also at the most unexpected moments.
Absolutely unexpected.
Yeah.
So he had a colleague. He was an Englishman with a Dutch name. Dear, I should remember, but we can look this up afterwards. Anyway, he was a well-known archaeologist.
Okay.
And so we went to see him and his Turkish wife, lovely people, and showed him this photograph and said, "Have you seen anything like that?" He said, "Yeah, you just go to the bazaar, and you find them for sale all over the place." They were made of felt. Now, what is felt? Felt is a fabric. It's not a textile because it's not woven.
Okay.
Right? It's pressed. So you take the sheep's wool and you fluff it all up,
Okay.
and then you press it together with and you wet it and roll it out and shape it the way you want it. And the herding people, so-called nomads,
Yeah.
throughout the whole of Central Asia, use felt. So you start, actually, there are felt makers in Hungary, which probably date from the Ottoman period, which was, 15th, 16th century, all the way out to Mongolia. And this band, I call it the felt band. And so we made several expeditions to find the felt makers in Turkey, and then we went to Iran one year. That was, when would that have been? Mid 70s. Everything was quite open in Iran until 1979, when the Shah was when there's a revolution against the Shah. And it's similar to the rock-hewn churches in Ethiopia. We knew that the heartland of felt making was Mongolia, because the Mongols do not weave. It's a society that does not weave. So I mean, in modern times, yes, you'll probably they make cashmere sweaters and things like this by machine. But the country folk, do not weave.
Okay, this is something I know absolutely nothing about. So
Well,
this is very
well, now you're learning something.
Yeah.
So everything that they need, they can make from felt.
Right.
Either from felt or from skins.
Okay.
So they make their coats, they make their trousers, their boots,
Everything.
their gloves, their hats, their overcoats, and most importantly, their tents.
Okay.
The so-called yurts. Yurt is a Russian word for an encampment of these tents. In Ethiopia, the name is ger, G-E-R. So, if you go into the countryside and you meet a herder, you will be immediately invited to drink tea and so many other products which they make locally in the ger. Anyway, so it was because of felt that I went to Mongolia for the first time in 1987 on the occasion of an international conference of Mongolian studies.
Okay.
And since that time, I've been, I don't know, 5 or 6 times.
Oh, you've continued to go?
Yeah, but again, I haven't been for quite a number of years now because kind of Ethiopia took over. I haven't had too much time. But
is that something you'd like to go back to?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But the exciting thing about Mongolia is the archaeology. Now, here's a open country, surrounded on the west by the Altai Mountains, perfect for pastoralism. In other words, shepherd people, because they live, they have sheep and they have goats and they have cows and they have horses. As long, that goes back at least to the Neolithic. And if they needed, I mentioned all the felt, if they needed other textiles, which were usually in the domain of the upper classes, the wealthy, they would buy them from the Chinese, or they'd buy them from Persia. So there was, they would provide the meat, right?
Okay,
they would provide the meat to the sedentary peoples to the south, or to the west, and in exchange they could then get luxury textiles.
Okay. Well, you'll be interested to know, because you're not on social media, you probably would not have seen this, but I've been seeing a lot more advertising of Mongolia, and I've been seeing a lot of people just trying to promote tourism there.
Yeah. Well,
over the last year or so,
my son has convinced me that we should go next year.
Okay.
So I've discussed this with the Mongolian embassy, and we're working in
trying
that
to
direction.
Make it happen. Right. Okay, so I slightly want to shift from that. I've asked every guest that we're having this question in the questionnaire that I sent you. I asked what specific topics you'd like to talk about, and you mentioned the importance of friendship and the capacity for self-expression and creativity. So I'd like to start with the first. The importance of friendship. I feel like now it's very easy to sort of isolate yourself and get distant. Or maybe it always has been. I'm not sure. But I want to know why that was one of the first.
Why is friendship important?
Well, I mean, obviously it's important, but from your perspective, from what you've learned, how has that sort of shaped you? And after so much time, why is that?
I think
the lasting thing.
Yeah, I mean, you may not realize it even when you're an undergraduate, but 30, 40 years later, you probably still find those people that you're talking to now still in your life. It's difficult to lose people, except through death. In other words, they're out there, you're there, they're there, and you don't hear from them for 10 years. It's like the student I told you about who got in touch with me.
40 years
many
later,
years after he'd done his PhD and spent a life teaching. So those were acquaintances. But then you will probably develop friendships with people, and often enough it does start in your undergraduate years. People that either your roommates or people you get along with in college that you continue to stay in contact with. So it depends on the individual. Some people are loners. they're fine to be by themselves most of their lives, but they still, you can. In monasticism, you have different kinds of monks. You have the cenobium, which is monks who live together in a community,
Okay.
but then you also have the independent monks who live more like hermits.
Yeah.
But they're still dependent on society. If you live as a hermit and you live in a cave somewhere, you still really depend on someone to bring you some food. So often the people who withdraw from societies cannot entirely escape society.
Yeah.
I mean, I have I have friends who have who live between here and Kingston who have basically they live in the woods. They've decided that it's a safer place to be.
A bit isolated.
Yeah, being isolated, and I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that. But friendship, it depends on your nature as well. I consider myself, an agreeable person. I can get along with others.
That checks out, I think.
Better with some than with others, but yeah.
Have you found it's harder to sort of communicate and interact with students now than it was 30 years ago?
That's a good question. Is it harder to integrate with them? I have office hours every week.
Mm-hmm.
Usually nobody comes, right? So the door is open.
Yeah.
I don't. If I see a student who I think has prospects for future in education, I sometimes I take them aside and I say, come, let's talk about this. And because I like to send students off to graduate school if I think they can handle it.
Didn't do that with me.
I do think I mentioned before that there is this general, I think, a greater sense of fear of that people have towards other people, which yeah. But and the question was really, is it easier to communicate with the students?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's easier, because at the end of the day, what you need is confidence. I think a student needs to feel confident that they can talk to a professor.
Yeah, for
right?
sure, 100%. I think that's also, I think, a lot of the time when like professors ask questions to the class, even just a very standard question of like, how are you, or how's the class? Like most of the time, I'll not answer because I just like
kind of a stupid question.
Yeah. Or no, not the question, but I don't want to say anything dumb or like to a whole class, because I also think in university everyone's sort of, everyone's trying to meet a certain standard. And yeah, I think there's this sort of thing where you don't want to say anything that's below that standard. Yeah, especially if you're talking to a professor.
No, I think you're right. I think students are anxious to speak out for fear that what they say may
come across as
may show their ignorance rather than their knowledge. But I always tell my students that we're intramural. We are within the walls of our learning space, and it's in that space that we should have the opportunity to share our thoughts. And I must say, I have heard from students that they'll never open their mouth in this or that classroom because the professor always takes them to task and tells them how stupid they are. Well, that's a stupid professor, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
And I would never tell a student they were wrong. I might say, let's look at it another way. And see if we can drag.
That's a more polite way of saying.
Well, yeah, I think you have. I mean, we're all sensitive, but I think we're particularly sensitive when we're students. So, communication is important. That is one of the things I had written down on my list that we should discuss. That people, it's really important in life to be able to express yourself and to sense how other people may be feeling. So in our multicultural society, we do need to be a little careful because we don't know how people will react to certain circumstances or situations. We know in our own community, more or less, what to expect, but from other communities we don't. So we need to be respectful. But we also, it doesn't hurt to ask questions.
Yeah,
right?
to stay curious.
I think most people are pleased when you're interested in what they do.
Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think now there's also a fear that comes with asking questions. Again, you don't want to come across as ignorant or come across as judgmental, and you don't want your question to be taken in the wrong way. And I think that then that's counterproductive because you just then also don't learn anything about where people are from or how they go about certain things. And I think in trying to, sort of, it's going to be difficult to word. I think in trying to make everyone fit as one, it sort of creates barriers that doesn't allow to appreciate the differences of everyone and the backgrounds of everyone.
Right.
If that makes sense. I don't know if I've worded that very well, but yeah.
There is governments, leaders try to avoid difference. They want to make everybody the same.
Uniform.
They want to make it uniform because they want everybody to hear what they want them to hear.
Yeah.
We've had some tensions on campus recently because of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. A lot of us are very sensitive to this, and I predicted so hear me out on this. In the 20th century, that's already 25 years ago, I said the 21st century is going to be very bad for minorities. And that's exactly what the situation is showing itself to be. Minorities are in an increasingly desperate situation because of those who want everybody to be uniform.
Yeah.
So, depending where you live, which country you live in, except I would say in Europe, much less so now in North America with what's going on south of the border, which is absolutely incredible. How this democratic country suddenly elects a potentate. It's as if they regretted having given up George III, because this guy, he's like George III. He's a crazy king.
Right.
So now we have to be careful now. I'm invited to a conference in 3 weeks' time in Washington.
America?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'm wondering whether I should go.
Right.
There's no reason why I shouldn't go. I'm an American citizen, but I'm a naturalized American, so I'm not as good as a naturally born one.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I will say that, like, obviously in many ways this whole thing is just ridiculous. But I've never seen, in the 7 years I've been here, I've never seen Canadian people so united.
Yeah, right.
And so proud of
Right. Well,
this
for the
country.
moment, it's in fact,
Which
it's
is a
generally
good thing until it gets to an extreme that it can become dangerous.
Well,
like everything.
I don't think in this country our
that's true.
being pro-Canadian would be dangerous. Right? It is a good, under the circumstances. Well, we perhaps we shouldn't spend too much time talking about politics because somebody's going to be offended. But one of the questions you had on your list, I don't know perhaps it's whether we need to go there now, but
We can.
what should we be anxious about today?
Yeah.
Right? What was it?
don't remember off the top of my head, but
right. It's what are the threats of for young people today, right?
Yeah.
They're very real. They're much more real than they were when I was your age. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a terrible war.
You think so?
I think so. I mean, I hope to be proven wrong.
Yeah.
But the way things are going, there's a lot of saber rattling going on in the world. Everybody's pouring huge amounts of money into weapons. And, the Ukrainian situation, perfect place for all powers to test their weapons.
Yeah.
So it depends.
Maybe this is naive, but I think that's exactly why a terrible war would not happen, because of all the weapons of mass destruction that we have. There hopefully won't be a war because it's just like it would create way too much damage. So many countries have nukes now, and
you think anybody cares about the damage? Look.
I said maybe this is naive thinking or wishful thinking, but yeah.
Maybe you won't remember, but when after 9/11, which is probably one of the reasons why the situation is happening as it is in the States today. Yeah. Americans were caught off guard, but they immediately, what did they do? They attacked Iran and Afghanistan. And the reason for attacking Iraq, not Iran. The reason for attacking Iraq was because of WMD, weapons of mass destruction, that this man was creating. He could destroy everything. This was entirely made up by the American government. They never found a weapon of mass destruction in the sand anywhere. So all of these people who died in Iraq, totally unnecessary.
Yeah.
But the Americans destroyed the infrastructure in order that they could go in and build it up again. There's this guy Cheney, the American vice president, who owned the companies that were going to go into Iraq and rebuild. So, bust it all up so we can make money fixing it. And, Trump wants to...
And recognition, I think, was their plan.
Well, whatever. There's just so much nonsense that comes out of government. I think young people have to watch out for that. You have to be careful not to accept what government is telling you. No, if you put this on the media and the Americans hear me saying that, I may never come back to Canada. But I'm dead serious. You've got to question. You have to question the situation. Because what's the alternative? I've told my students, if there's a war, head for the hills. Why die for some government idea?
Yeah.
That doesn't really affect you.
Unless there's a direct force and opposition that's trying to take something away from you or your lands.
Yeah. Well, if you think,
then I think there's reason to fight, but not to fight like a bunch of politicians is wars. And
I mean, if I think of an example of the recent wars in Ethiopia, some local people tried to defend themselves by, for example, shooting at Eritrean troops. Okay. A couple of Eritreans got killed. This in the capital of ancient Ethiopia, Aksum. This occurred. The locals attacked the Eritrean troops. Next day, the Eritreans came in and massacred hundreds of people. So you're better off not confronting them because they're much stronger than you. Yeah. It would have been much better for the people locally to have gone off and gotten away from these troops. Anyway, this is an irresolvable question, but I think it's important to avoid extremes. Keep away from the right,
absolutely,
which is just as dangerous as the far left.
For sure.
I think, the middle course is...
Yeah, because I think if certain people go to one extreme, then the counter response is for another group of people to go to the other extreme, and then it just creates this huge conflict.
Exactly.
But yeah, to then flip that question, what do you think my generation, younger, a bit older, has to look forward to?
Every opportunity. You have more opportunities, again, because of the possibilities of modern society. Communications being one, transportation and travel being another. So easy to move around. When we came to North America, we took these great ocean liners, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. And now it took you maybe a week to cross the Atlantic Ocean now, and which meant that you had to be able to afford that much time. Yeah. So if you had a 2-week vacation, you weren't going to go to Europe. No. Now you can go to Europe for the weekend. So, and it's not that. It's expensive. If you don't have the money, it's always expensive. But you can still do it. I think students can always find enough money to go backpacking in Europe.
In terms of that, do you think, would you recommend that to young people? I think there's always this debate of, would I rather save my money or spend it on like my early 20s just getting all these experiences from traveling or opportunities that you wouldn't have in any other age? What would you sort of recommend? Would you recommend spending that money that you have saved to travel, to see what's around you?
I think it depends on the individual. I usually travel not because I want to go somewhere where I haven't been, but because there's something there that I want to see, right? And I have an objective in my travel. But again, when you're an undergrad or when you've just graduated, it's a great time to travel because you will meet people who could change your life. Now, I always recommend also that you travel by yourself rather than taking a pal or a girlfriend, because you lock yourself away from everybody. If you're it's easier for guys, but I've known. Again, when I was a graduate student, I went to Germany to learn German. I met some other students there. I remember there was one girl who had traveled by herself across Turkey and Central Asia, all by herself, and she'd come away unscathed. I don't want to speak for the girls, but yeah, I remember once there was a meeting of students in college, and there's these guys who had been to Turkey. And so they came back and were telling others about their experience. And the question, maybe it was a woman there, said, what about two girls traveling together? And the answer was double the trouble. In other words, you're going to get twice as much trouble if there's more. So I don't really have an answer to that. But travel is so educational, and it broadens the mind, gives you an opportunity to realize that there are other people out there in the world. Superficially, people do, there's a lot in common, but not very deep down, very different. And it's important to, again, especially in a place like Toronto, which has such an influx of newcomers. Yeah. It's hard to find people born in Canada, right? So our neighbors are from other places, and it's good to know how if you can, find out how they work.
Okay. I think that is a good note to leave it on.
Okay.
A hopeful and a positive note. Unless there's anything else that you would like to mention. Is there anything that you'd like to say that you have coming up? Any books or manuscripts?
That people should read? You mean?
No, that you yourself are working on that you'd like to share.
Oh, well.
Before it comes out? Or
not got another hour? No. Yeah, well, I like to, I think Oh, that's something I wanted to say, and this is going to. Some people will be bothered by my saying it, but I think it's better to be. It's important to be productive and innovative, which as a professor you can be. It's hard work. Now, our peers expect us, in order to get through the career, to be researching and especially publishing all the time. But there are some, and the university, like government, is filled with it, and that's administration. I think people give up. Academics who go into administration kind of give up their professional career. In a way, it's easier to tell other people what to do than to do it yourself, right? I kind of abhor a job in which you have to tell other people what to do. I wouldn't do it myself. If somebody said to me, would you consider becoming a dean? No way. I don't want to deal with everybody's problems.
Do you have trouble telling students what to do? When there's...
I don't have trouble telling students what to do because they're doing it for themselves.
That's true.
Right? The whole idea of teaching is that they should one day be able to step into my shoes. But to be there, basically making decisions about what people can do with their time and how they should do it, I think is a cop-out. And another thing, I, from time to time, disagree with the administration. Right? I mean, I think probably we all do. Whether you disagree with your parents, that's another matter. You've got to respect your parents. Respect, something I really want to say, respect is important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. If I have a problem with the administration of the University of Toronto, I confront it.
Have you ever?
And, oh, yeah. There was a question once about when I could take my sabbatical. And they said, no. I said, it's now. Now's the time for my sabbatical. And they said, no, you have to wait another year or 6 months or something. And I stuck to my guns because I knew that for the administration, it's a job. They have nothing. They've got nothing. They've got no invested interest really in whether I have my sabbatical now or 6 months down the line. But they're following the book. They got their own rules and they want to stick to the rules. I stand my ground. They always collapse, always, because I have a vested interest that they don't have.
Right.
Okay, that's one thing. I'm just mentioning this now.
No, please.
One of my worst experiences in teaching at UTSC is the bus ride.
Yeah.
Right? Now.
Yep. The 905.
The 905. I don't like to stand.
Okay.
Right? I mean, it's uncomfortable. I'm going to teach all day long. I'm exhausted by the time I get to the college, just hanging on to this thing. Once, maybe twice, a student has offered me a seat.
Really?
Once or twice on that bus.
That's it?
That's it. I was in London a few weeks ago on the Underground. In 1 week, 3 people offered me a place to sit down on the Underground in London,
right.
UK. I mean, how many millions of people are there? But getting a student to get out to give a professor a seat on the bus is like squeezing a dry orange. I'm mentioning that because
I'm surprised at that.
Well, I got on the bus last week, absolutely packed. I said, "Oh my God, am I going to get off and wait for the next bus? Or am I?" Because I had a meeting, I needed to get there, and I was towards the back, and more people were getting on. So I went up the steps into the back, and thank the Lord there was a seat with somebody's bag on it, right? So I sat down. But I'm not blaming the students. I just think there's maybe it's both it's a TTC problem, it's a U of T problem, and it's I would say somewhat of a lack of concern about the revered professor, who's the next time they see him, he's going to be in front of them in the classroom. Okay, that's enough.
Yeah. No, that's good. But I find that very surprising, honestly. But yeah.
Well, sometimes maybe if I've been in front of the bus where there are seats for those who need them,
the blue seats.
But I can't ask for that. I'm not going to ask for somebody to get up.
Yeah, I always find it a bit sketchy when people who seem able take all the blue seats at a busy time. That's
right. Well,
that's never a good sign.
Well, I guess we're not going to make a big deal of it, but for me that is a question of respect, and the same thing. The guys should. I really believe one should respect women to the extent that even if they're young, a guy is sitting down, he can give his seat to a girl. Why not? I think there's less respect from. We were talking about this before, among individuals now than there was.
Okay.
Okay.
Then I think we'll wrap it on that note.
Okay.
All right.